Delhi, December 12th, 1911. The air trembled with drums, bugles, and the thunder of cavalry hooves. Coronation Park shimmered in the winter sun, transformed into an arena of power where 500,000 people pressed forward to witness history. Before them rose an ocean of color, white tents, blazing banners, gem-studded turbans, polished bayonets flashing like lightning. Dust curled upward as elephants swayed into view, their bells chiming, their howdahs heavy with princes. At the heart of this grand pageant sat George V, crowned King of Great Britain and, for the first time in person, proclaimed Emperor of India. Yet it was not only his coronation the crowd had come to see. At his side stood a figure whose presence was quieter, but no less commanding, Mary of Teck. Dignified and composed, she carried herself with a steadiness that seemed to root the entire spectacle. To some, she was simply a consort. In truth, she was the compass of the monarchy's future. The Delhi Durbar was theater. Yes, flags, fireworks, and cannons echoing across the plain. But beneath the spectacle lurked questions. How long could an empire of so many voices hold together? Could crowns and ceremony withstand the storms of a new century? Mary did not speak, but she saw. Where her husband embodied continuity, she embodied endurance. Where he wore the crown, she bore its meaning. This was no finale. It was an opening act. The crowd roared, elephants trumpeted, salutes split the sky, but the real story was only beginning. For the woman beside the emperor would guide Britain's monarchy through war, upheaval, and the fading light of empire. And long after the dust of Delhi had settled, her steady gaze would remain. Kensington Palace, London, May 26, 1867. Long before she stood beneath the burning sun of Delhi, Mary of Teck opened her eyes in a palace heavy with echoes. She was born in the very room where Queen Victoria had first drawn breath 48 years earlier, a symbolic inheritance, though at the time, no one thought this infant girl would ever shape the monarchy's survival. Her full name was a mouthful fit for Europe's tangled dynasties: Victoria, Mary Augusta, Louise, Olga, Pauline, Claudine Agnes. Yet to her family, she was simply May, a nickname as unassuming as her future would be improbable. Her bloodline was a curious mixture: German through her father, Prince Francis of Teck, a duke with more title than fortune; British through her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide, a granddaughter of King George III. Thus, from the moment of her birth, May was both an insider and an outsider, close enough to the crown to feel its glow, distant enough to sense its chill. The family's finances told the story plainly. While Kensington gave the illusion of grandeur, behind its doors the Tecks lived beyond their means, weighed down by expectations they could not afford. May's childhood was not gilded extravagance, but measured frugality. She learned discipline where others learned indulgence, humility where others practiced entitlement. Those lessons would harden into qualities the monarchy would one day rely upon: steadiness, economy, a refusal to be dazzled by luxury. But as a child, she was simply the shy girl who read too much, the daughter of a German duke without a fortune, the cousin of a queen who ruled the mightiest empire on earth. No one watching her then could have guessed that this quiet May would one day outlast wars, scandals, and abdications, becoming the iron thread, holding together a monarchy fraying at the edges. A changing world, the late 19th century. When Mary of Teck was born in 1867. Britain was not the same Britain her great-grandfather, George III, had ruled. It was a nation already reshaped by fire, steam, and steel. The first industrial revolution had cracked the old rhythms of rural life, trading fields for factories, horses for locomotives, oil lamps for electric light. London itself was transforming, its streets choked with smoke, its nights lit by gas, its mornings rattled by trains that carried millions into the new age. By the 1870s, when young May took her first lessons in French and German, the world was spinning faster than any child could comprehend. Telegraph wires stitched continents together in hours. Photographs froze faces that once would have vanished into memory. Soon, the automobile would shrink distances, and the radio would give a voice to the invisible. Technology no longer whispered. It shouted, and it would not stop. But the machines were not the only revolution. Politics, too, was breaking old molds. When Queen Victoria had been born in 1819, Britain was a plutocracy, its power guarded by landowners and aristocrats. By Mary's adolescence, that world was already slipping away. The Reform Acts had cracked open the gates, and the march toward full democracy was unstoppable. The monarchy, once the apex of absolute power, was learning to survive by reinvention. It was into this storm of change that May quietly matured, bookish, observant, and cautious. While the world glorified speed and invention, she absorbed the subtler lesson that survival required steadiness. One day, when her husband's crown would wobble beneath the weight of world war and social upheaval, it would be her calm, forged in these restless years, that held the monarchy steady. Childhood and character. A princess in shadows. On paper, Mary of Teck's childhood should have been one of privilege. She lived at Kensington Palace, walked halls where monarchs had been born, and carried blood that traced back to George III. But paper lies. Behind the stone walls, the Teck family was weighed down not by wealth, but by appearances. Her father, the Duke of Teck, had noble titles, but little income. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide, received a parliamentary allowance, but it was never enough to sustain the ceremonies and households expected of a royal cousin. The family often teetered on the edge of debt, maintaining grandeur with coins that barely covered necessity. And so, young May's world was smaller than it seemed. Tutors were chosen for economy, not brilliance. Her governess, Helene Bricca, was Alsatian, practical, kind, but far from the elite instructors enjoyed by other royal children. Yet from this restraint grew qualities no fortune could buy. May learned discipline where others learned indulgence, charity where others practiced entitlement. She walked among the poor with her mother, not as spectacle, but as lesson. Compassion became part of her inheritance. At 16, she was sent to Florence, city of Renaissance brilliance. There she absorbed art, languages, and history, returning to London fluent in French, German, and Italian. Court observers would later call her shy, even awkward, more interested in books than balls, in reflection than display. But beneath that quiet exterior was steel. She was not the glittering socialite Victoria might have imagined for a queen, but something rarer, a woman whose restraint was her strength. It was this shy, bookish girl, raised in frugality, disciplined by necessity, who would one day steady a monarchy lurching through crisis. While others chased luxury, Mary was learning endurance, and endurance in the century ahead would prove more valuable than diamonds. Marriage arrangements, the promise and the funeral. For every princess of Europe, the question of marriage was not personal, it was political. And for Mary of Teck, the quiet girl called May, destiny seemed clear enough. She was royal, but not royal enough to reach the thrones of Europe, too elevated to marry a commoner, too distant to catch the eyes of emperors. She seemed destined for the second or third sons of some minor house, a duchess in a corner of the continent, her name remembered only in genealogies. But Queen Victoria had other plans. The iron-willed monarch, who had ruled Britain since 1837, saw in May a remedy for her wayward grandson, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. He was heir to the throne after his father, the future Edward VII, and he was trouble. Charming but unreliable, scandal shadowed his name, whispers of brothels, rumors darker still. Victoria hoped Mary's steadiness could anchor him. A match was arranged. For May, it seemed an improbable ascent, from the frugal halls of Kensington to the near certainty of becoming Queen of the United Kingdom. Engagement whispers filled the air. But before vows could be spoken, fate intervened. In January 1892, Albert Victor contracted pneumonia during an influenza outbreak. Within days, he was gone. The court mourned, the nation grieved, and Mary, newly 24, was left adrift. Observers noted how deeply the loss cut her, not merely the man, but the destiny he carried. In one cruel winter, the future she had been promised collapsed into silence. Yet history is ruthless, but not random. The crown had lost an heir, but it had not lost its need for Mary. Another path would soon open, one even closer to the throne. And from this tragedy, her true destiny would rise, a new match, George and the making of a royal family. From grief came an unexpected second chance. With Albert Victor gone, the line of succession shifted to his younger brother, Prince George, Duke of York. Where Albert Victor had been flamboyant, George was reserved. Where one courted scandal, the other clung to discipline. He had served in the Royal Navy, lived with the clockwork precision of a ship's captain, and carried himself with the stiff, almost severe sense of duty that would define his reign. George's heart, however, had been elsewhere. He had fallen for Lady Margaret Daisy Stonor, a commoner and daughter of one of Queen Alexandra's ladies-in-waiting. But marriage to Daisy was impossible. The heir's brother could not take a wife beneath his station. And so, with Albert Victor's death, eyes turned back to Mary of Teck, reliable, steady, already approved by Queen Victoria. On July the 6th, 1893, George and Mary were married at St. James's Palace. To the public, it was a union of duty and destiny. To the couple themselves, it was more complicated. George was dutiful, but emotionally distant, often expressing affection in letters rather than words. Mary, composed yet warm, longed for intimacy, but accepted formality. Their partnership was not the romance of novels, but it was something rarer in monarchy, resilient. Over time, affection grew into respect, and respect into reliance. Together, they built a family of 6 children. The eldest, Edward, would one day ignite a constitutional crisis. The second, Albert, shy and plagued by a stammer, would, against all odds, lead Britain through war as George VI. Others would carve their own fates, some glorious, some tragic. For now, though, George and Mary were simply the Duke and Duchess of York, splitting their lives between London and Sandringham. To outsiders, it was domestic bliss. Yet beneath the surface, the strict discipline of George and the quiet steel of Mary were shaping a household that would one day bear the full weight of empire. From York to Wales, heirs to an empire. The closing years of the 19th century shifted the ground beneath George and Mary. They had settled into their role as Duke and Duchess of York, dutiful if not dazzling, when history suddenly accelerated. In January 1901, Queen Victoria died after a reign of 63 years, the only monarch most Britons had ever known. Her death was not just the passing of a sovereign, it was the end of an era. The Victorian age, with its certainties and its empire at full tide, dissolved overnight into something more fragile, more uncertain. Edward VII, already 59, and long impatient for the throne, finally became king. And with that, George, now the heir apparent, was created Prince of Wales. Mary, in turn, became Princess of Wales, second only to the Queen in prominence. The shift was more than titles. With it came a heavier calendar, endless royal engagements, and a place under the sharpest lights of empire. George longed for Sandringham, for hunting, and the familiar rhythm of country life. Mary, by contrast, thrived in London's courts and charities, where her intelligence and warmth shone through. Their partnership balanced the scales. His discipline anchored them, her tact endeared them. Almost immediately, they were dispatched across the globe to demonstrate imperial unity. In 1901, they toured Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, an exhausting journey by steamship and rail, designed to remind distant subjects that they belonged to one crown. Crowds cheered, parades thundered, but the cost was high. Their children were left behind, and duty began to eclipse family life. For Mary, these years were a crucible. She had entered marriage as a shy duchess. She emerged as a future queen, tempered by travel, tested by public scrutiny, and already preparing, perhaps unconsciously, for the storms that would engulf Europe and the monarchy within little more than a decade. The crown ascends, coronation, and the Durbar. By 1910, the empire's rhythm was faltering. Edward VII, indulgent and weary, succumbed to illness in May. When the bells tolled his death, Britain turned to George, the quiet naval officer, the stern father, the dutiful son. He was now George V, King of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India. At his side, Mary, once the overlooked Princess of Teck, stepped into the role for which her entire life had unknowingly prepared her, Queen Consort. Their coronation, delayed until June 1911, unfolded in Westminster Abbey with all the ancient choreography of monarchy. Kings and queens of Europe gathered for the last time, before a war would scatter their crowns like broken glass. Mary wore a cream gown heavy with symbols of empire, roses for England, thistles for Scotland, shamrocks for Ireland, the Star of India blazing on her chest. Together, she and George were crowned not just rulers of Britain, but of a world-spanning dominion. Yet London was only the first stage. Across the seas, another throne awaited. In December 1911, George and Mary traveled to Delhi for the Great Durbar, the first monarchs ever to attend in person. Coronation Park became an amphitheater of empire, elephants draped in silk, cannons echoing across the plains. 500,000 subjects pressing forward to see their rulers. Mary stood at George's side, calm beneath the weight of a new world. To the cheering crowds, the moment seemed eternal, an empire crowned in sunlight. But Mary, sharp-eyed and instinctive, must have sensed what the pageantry hid. The empire was too vast, the century too restless. Behind the trumpets of Delhi lay the silence of wars to come, abdications unimagined, and an empire whose sun was already tilting toward dusk. A queen's style, brains beside the crown. The London coronation had dazzled. The Delhi Durbar had thundered. But when the pageantry faded, the real work of monarchy began. And here, Mary of Teck revealed her quiet genius. Unlike Queen Alexandra before her, who lived as a glittering figure apart, Mary chose a different path. She positioned herself not as an ornament, but as a partner. Where George was stiff, she was supple. Where he preferred retreat, she leaned into the public gaze. The monarchy, under their stewardship, became a two-person act. But it was Mary who gave it rhythm. She understood what many royals did not, that survival in a democratizing age depended not on jewels or ceremony, but on relevance. Britain was no longer the world of gilded drawing rooms. It was a nation of miners, factory hands, and restless voters. When strikes erupted in the coalfields of Glamorgan in 1912, Mary insisted on visiting the collieries with George. Dressed in sober clothes, she descended into the dust and shadows, shaking the calloused hands of men who risked their lives beneath the earth. For the first time, workers saw a queen not on a balcony, but at their side. Her instincts were not always aligned with progress. She had little patience for the suffragettes who chained themselves to gates or hurled themselves onto racetracks. When Emily Davison fell beneath the king's horse at the Epsom Derby in 1913, Mary recoiled, not at the injustice, but at the violence of protest. To her, change must come with dignity, not disruption. Yet even in her conservatism, Mary sensed something vital. The monarchy had to be seen, had to be felt. She urged George to speak with people he would rather ignore, to smile where he preferred silence. Quietly, invisibly, she was shaping a monarchy that would endure storms no coronation could anticipate. The Great War, a queen in the shadows of battle. By the summer of 1914, Europe was a chessboard trembling on the edge of collapse. Assassination in Sarajevo lit the fuse, and in weeks, a chain of declarations dragged the continent into war. For George V, the conflict was a family feud, written in blood. His cousin Wilhelm II ruled Germany. Another cousin, Nicholas II, commanded Russia. Now, Britain faced one, allied with the other, and the royal family's German heritage suddenly felt like a curse. The king braced for war, the queen braced for sacrifice. Mary of Teck understood instinctively that her role would not be on battlefields, but in living rooms, hospitals, and factories. From the very first days, she threw herself into relief efforts. The Queen Mary's Needlework Guild grew from a modest initiative into a national movement. Tens of thousands of women knitting socks, gloves, and garments for soldiers and refugees. By 1915, St. James's Palace was drowning in parcels, a tide of wool and compassion ready to be shipped to the front. But Mary went beyond patronage. She believed the monarchy must embody the wartime spirit of duty and restraint. She cut luxuries from the royal household, imposed frugality on herself, and made sure the public knew it. If soldiers could endure mud and gas in Flanders, the royals could forego extravagance. Symbolism mattered, and she wielded it like a weapon. Her courage was practical, not theatrical. She visited hospitals, speaking gently to young men whose faces were bandaged beyond recognition. She walked factory floors, encouraging women who had replaced men at the machines. Even trade union leaders, usually wary of royalty, admitted her sincerity. Amid the thunder of war, Mary of Teck became something rare, a queen not of distance, but of endurance. And when victory finally came in 1918, battered and incomplete, it was clear the monarchy had survived not by might of armies, but by the quiet, steady labor of a woman who knew how to make sacrifice visible. After the war, the Queen's dollhouse. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Britain was not triumphant, but exhausted. 1 million lives lost, cities scarred, a generation of sons never to return. The monarchy, too, was changed. George looked diminished, the crown heavier than ever. Mary, by contrast, seemed sharpened by duty. Her wartime work had not just supported the nation, it had redefined what a queen could be. And so, when peace crept cautiously back into daily life, the country sought a way to honor her. The idea came from Princess Marie Louise, Mary's cousin and childhood friend, a gift, not of jewels or crowns, but of imagination. She enlisted Sir Edwin Lutyens, the empire's great architect, to design something extraordinary, a dollhouse, but unlike any the world had seen. Built to a scale of 1 inch to 1 foot, the house rose taller than a man's waist, with 4 floors that mirrored an Edwardian manor in perfect miniature. Every room was a triumph of craftsmanship. Tiny books written by Britain's finest authors, paintings shrunk to fit gilt frames, crystal goblets no larger than thimbles, a wine cellar stocked with bottles that actually held wine. Even the cutlery gleamed in silver, as precise as the table it adorned. Hundreds of artisans and tradespeople poured their skill into the project, a nation's gratitude rendered in wood, glass, and stone. In 1924, the dollhouse was presented to Mary. She smiled, a rare softening of her famously disciplined face. It was no child's toy, but a monument, a symbolic palace within the palace, capturing the grandeur of empire at its peak, even as the world outside began to shift toward decline. Installed at Windsor Castle in 1925, it remains to this day, a reminder that sometimes history is preserved not in marble or monuments, but in the delicate scale of devotion. The 1920s, strengthening the crown, testing the family. The 1920s opened with unease. The war was over, but the peace was brittle. Across Europe, monarchies had toppled. The Romanovs shot in a cellar, the Habsburgs dethroned, the Kaiser exiled. In Britain, Republicans whispered that the crown was outdated, a relic in a world of parliaments and labor strikes. Mary of Teck grasped what was at stake. If the monarchy wished to endure, it could not hide in palaces. It had to be seen, useful, human. She became the architect of a new royal mission, visibility with purpose. At Buckingham Palace, George began keeping a chart of engagements, meticulously recording appearances and charitable work. Mary herself threw her weight behind hospitals, children's welfare, and housing projects. She walked among working-class families, shook hands in coal towns, listened in schools. Her message was clear. The monarchy was not aloof. It was present. It worked. Against the tide of republicanism, the royal family grew more popular, more trusted. Remarkably, by the decade's end, the crown stood stronger than at the beginning, an inversion of history's usual script. But while the monarchy flourished in public, Mary's private world grew more complicated. Her children, now adults, carried both promise and peril. Albert, reserved but dependable, married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon and began confronting his crippling stammer. Princess Mary, responsible and composed, married Henry Lascelles and served dutifully. Yet the others brought only trouble. Prince Henry courted scandal with affairs. Prince George of Kent drifted into rumors of illegitimacy. Worst of all, Edward, the heir, remained unmarried, a charming playboy with no sense of duty. Mary, ever disciplined, chose silence. Yet the silence was dangerous. Thus, the 1920s were a paradox. The monarchy stronger than ever in the eyes of the nation. But inside its walls, cracks were forming. Cracks that would soon fracture the crown itself. The collector, passion, or kleptomania. While George V retreated into the quiet obsession of stamp collecting, Mary of Teck found her solace and her reputation in objects of art. From the 1920s onward, she became one of the most relentless collectors in royal history. Paintings, porcelain, jade figurines, Fabergé eggs, jeweled boxes. Her appetite for acquisition seemed insatiable. She scoured Europe's auction houses, private estates, and even the drawing rooms of her own aristocratic friends. Her interests were broad, but not refined. Unlike Charles I, who had filled royal halls with masterpieces by Titian and Van Dyck, Mary leaned toward quantity rather than quality. Portraits of forgotten nobles, ornate trinkets, historical curiosities, all found a place in her growing empire of objects. Birds in particular fascinated her. Avian motifs appeared again and again in her acquisitions. But the collecting came with whispers. Aristocrats noticed how the Queen's eye would linger on a particular vase or jewel during a visit. Soon enough, the item would be gifted to her. The host obliged by centuries of tradition and the subtle pressure of royal favor. Servants gossiped, newspapers hinted, and later dramatists portrayed her as a kleptomaniac, slipping treasures from other people's homes into her purse. The truth was subtler. Mary rarely stole outright. Rather, she wielded the power of expectation. Her requests were veiled, but unmistakable. And importantly, much of what she acquired entered the royal collection, held in trust for the nation. To her mind, she was not hoarding, but preserving, ensuring that history itself would be safeguarded in the crown's vaults. Yet the irony was sharp. The Queen, who had built her public image on discipline and frugality in life, was, in private, consumed by the compulsion to possess. For admirers, she was a guardian of heritage. For critics, a royal magpie. For history, she remains both, the fading king, jubilee, and death. By the late 1920s, George V was an old man before his time. Years of chain smoking had carved his lungs into ruin. A fall from a horse during the war left him fragile, his body never fully healing. He suffered recurring bouts of bronchitis and septicemia, confined to bed for weeks at a time. Photographs of the king showed a gaunt face, eyes shadowed, energy drained. Where the monarchy once projected vigor, it now projected frailty. Mary endured it all with her characteristic stoicism. She rarely betrayed emotion, never faltered in public, and shielded her children from despair. Yet in private, she was the steady nurse, the vigilant guardian. Her letters reveal a woman quietly carrying a burden, a husband crumbling, an heir she did not trust, and a crown at risk of stumbling into chaos. In 1935, against medical advice, George insisted on celebrating his silver jubilee, 25 years on the throne. It was the first of its kind in British history. Across the empire, streets filled with parades, church bells rang, and portraits of the king and queen were hung in schools and village halls. In his speech, George gave special praise to Mary, acknowledging the partner who had carried him through decades of duty. The nation rejoiced, unaware it was the monarchy's last great pageant before crisis. 8 months later, on January 20th, 1936, George V died at Sandringham. The end itself was shrouded in controversy. His physician, Lord Dawson, administered a lethal dose of morphine and cocaine, an act intended, he later admitted, to hasten the king's death so that the announcement could appear in the more dignified morning papers. The king's passing closed a chapter of endurance. For Mary, it was both a personal loss and the beginning of a storm. For at the very moment she became Queen Dowager, her eldest son, Edward VIII, prepared to throw the monarchy into its gravest crisis in centuries. The abdication crisis, a queen mother's silence. The death of George V in January 1936 thrust Edward, the Prince of Wales, onto the throne as King Edward VIII. Charismatic, fashionable, adored by the public, he seemed the modern monarch Britain craved. But Mary knew her son too well. Behind the charm was a restlessness, a disdain for duty, and above all, an obsession with a woman who would bring the monarchy to the brink. Wallis Simpson. Wallis was everything tradition forbade. An American, divorced once, in the process of divorcing again. To marry her would be to defy church, parliament, and empire. Yet Edward was unyielding. He flaunted the relationship in photographs, whisked Wallis away to Mediterranean holidays, and ignored counsel from ministers. To the public, rumors simmered. To Mary, the danger was unmistakable, and yet she remained silent. Unlike her husband, who had confronted Edward in life, Mary chose distance. She did not lecture her son. She did not plead. Instead, she maneuvered quietly, even working with government ministers, to delay Wallis's divorce, hoping the problem might solve itself. It did not. By November 1936, the crisis exploded into the open. Edward demanded to marry Wallis. The government threatened resignation. The crown itself trembled. Only then did Mary act directly. She invited Edward for tea and, with measured words, urged him to think not of himself, but of his younger brother Albert, unprepared to be king. But Edward would not bend. On December 11th, 1936, he abdicated in a radio address that stunned the world, choosing love over duty, Wallis over crown. Mary listened as her eldest son abandoned the throne his father had died protecting. That night, she turned to Albert, now George VI, and kissed his hand, the gesture of a subject to a sovereign. In that moment, Mary secured continuity. But as a mother, she bore a wound that would never fully heal. One son lost to scandal, another thrust unwillingly into destiny. The Queen Dowager, between crises. With Edward gone and Albert, now George VI, reluctantly crowned, Mary of Teck stepped into a new role. Queen Dowager, widow of a king, mother of a sovereign, matriarch of a wounded dynasty. The abdication had shaken the monarchy's foundations, but Mary knew the work of repair could not wait. She retreated from the spotlight just enough to allow her daughter-in-law, Queen Elizabeth, to shine. Yet she remained an unyielding presence behind the scenes. Ministers still sought her counsel. Courtiers still measured her reactions. She was no longer the crown's public face, but she was still its iron spine. Her own life, however, teetered on fragility. In May 1939, while being driven through Putney, a lorry, stacked high with steel tubes, overturned beside her car. The vehicle rolled onto its side, trapping Mary inside. For a moment, Britain held its breath. The Queen Mother of the Empire nearly crushed in an instant. She was pulled out by ladder, shaken but alive. Newspapers rushed to print the story. When asked how she felt, she famously replied, with unflappable calm, "I think I need a cup of tea." The line became legend, a symbol of the stoicism Britain clung to on the eve of war. And war was coming. Across the Channel, Hitler annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, his ambitions unmistakable. In London, the memory of Edward's controversial visit to Germany in 1937 still festered. Mary watched anxiously as storm clouds gathered, knowing her family would again be tested, not just by scandal this time, but by survival itself. When German bombs would one day fall on London, she would not be queen, but she would still be a figure of endurance. The nation had already learned. Where others panicked, Mary of Teck steadied. The Second World War, a queen in wartime. Again, when Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, Mary of Teck was 72 years old. She had lived through one world war already. Now, astonishingly, she was to endure another. The bombs would not fall on distant trenches this time. They would fall on London itself. Mary left the capital for safety, settling at Badminton in Gloucestershire. But retreat did not mean idleness. She refused to fade into comfortable seclusion. Instead, she traveled the countryside, visiting hospitals and schools, speaking with evacuees, and knitting tirelessly. Her hands, now marked by age, produced an immense carpet, later sold for $100,000, a fortune donated directly to the exchequer of a nation bleeding treasure and lives. She embodied what Britain demanded in its darkest hour: frugality, sacrifice, and unflinching calm. If the royal palaces had blacked-out windows and ration books, so did Mary. She set an example that resonated deeply with ordinary families huddled in air raid shelters. Symbolism mattered, and Mary knew better than anyone how to wield it. Her presence also carried moral weight. When Edward and Wallis, now the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, visited Nazi Germany in 1937, the monarchy's reputation had been stained. Mary's steadfast conduct during the Blitz helped repair the damage, reminding the public that while one branch of the family had flirted with disgrace, the matriarch remained unshakably loyal to Britain. Even in age, she bore herself like a soldier. Her diary entries spoke of duty, never fear. And when the bombs fell, tearing through London's streets, she did not waver. The queen who had once steadied the monarchy during the Great War did so again, proving that endurance, not glamour, not power, was the crown's truest shield. After the war, an empire unraveling. In May 1945, the guns fell silent once more. Britain celebrated victory, but the jubilation was thinly veiled with exhaustion. The war had left the nation victorious, yet impoverished, triumphant, yet diminished. And for Mary of Teck, now in her late 70s, the peace revealed an even harsher truth. The empire she had helped embody at the Delhi Durbar in 1911 was crumbling before her eyes. Demographics, economics, and history conspired against Britain. A small island could no longer command half the globe. Movements for self-determination surged across Asia and Africa. In 1947, Mary watched the jewel of the empire, India, fracture into two nations, India and Pakistan, its independence marred by partition and violence. The very land where she had once been hailed as empress now slipped beyond Britain's grasp. More blows followed. Revolutions stirred in Egypt. Independence cries echoed from Africa to the Caribbean. Monarchies across Europe had already fallen. The Romanovs murdered, the Habsburgs scattered, the Italian crown abolished. Britain's monarchy endured, but only by adapting. For Mary, who had once stood at Coronation Park as the symbol of empire at its zenith, the reversal was bitter. At home, politics shifted as well. The Labour government of 1945 introduced sweeping reforms: the welfare state, the National Health Service. Mary, steeped in Victorian ideals of private charity, opposed the intrusion of government into the intimate lives of its people. To her, generosity came from noblesse oblige, not taxation. Yet she kept her disagreements quiet, embodying her creed of duty above opinion. Through it all, she continued her rounds of charity, hospital visits, and quiet encouragement. The empire's sun was setting, but Mary's discipline did not falter. If Britain could not rule the world, it could still rule itself with dignity, and she, as ever, insisted the crown must lead by example. The final years, a last link to Victoria. By the early 1950s, Mary of Teck was an old woman in a kingdom that scarcely resembled the one of her youth. She had buried 2 sons, Prince John in 1919, Prince George, Duke of Kent in 1942, and now watched with dread as her second son, George VI, wasted away from the same respiratory afflictions that had claimed her husband. In February 1952, the king died at just 56, leaving his daughter Elizabeth to inherit the throne. It was Mary who first kissed Elizabeth's hand, acknowledging her granddaughter as Queen Elizabeth II. In that simple, intimate gesture, she bound together the past and the future, from Queen Victoria's shadow to a new Elizabethan age. Yet even as she saluted continuity, her own strength was fading. Mary turned 85 in May 1952, but celebration was muted. She suffered from stomach ailments, failing eyesight, and the creeping exhaustion of age. Marlborough House, once her bustling residence, grew quiet. Curtains were drawn against the light that hurt her eyes. Visitors described her as dignified but diminished, a once indomitable figure now confined to bed. On March 24, 1953, just months before Elizabeth's coronation, Mary of Teck died peacefully at Marlborough House. The official announcement spoke of a gentle passing, but an autopsy revealed lung cancer had hastened her end. Britain mourned deeply. Crowds queued for hours to view her lying in state, as if saying farewell, not just to a queen, but to the last living thread of the Victorian world. Her funeral at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, laid her beside George V of Churchill, once again Prime Minister, declared her death the passing of an era. And indeed it was. For with Mary of Teck, the final ember of the Victorian Empire was extinguished, leaving her granddaughter to build a monarchy fit for a new, uncertain century. Legacy. The matriarch remembered Mary of Teck's death in 1953 closed not just a life, but an epoch. She had been born when gas lamps lit London, crowned when the empire spanned oceans, and buried in a world where that empire was dissolving into memory. Yet her presence still lingers in Britain's institutions, its culture, and its monarchy. Her name endures in stone and scholarship. In London's East End, the fire that destroyed Queen's Hall in 1931 led to the founding of Queen Mary College, named in her honor and formally opened by Mary herself in 1934. Across the former empire, from Lahore to Canada, schools and hospitals still bear her name. Even Wimbledon's royal connection, so natural today, began with Mary's patronage in 1906, and her appearances courtside established a tradition that continues under today's Princess of Wales. Culturally, she remains both admired and controversial. Admirers see in her the iron discipline that held the monarchy together through world wars and abdication, through scandal and decline. She transformed the crown from a symbol of distance into a partner of the people, ensuring its survival when others fell. Critics, however, dwell on the whispers of kleptomania, her relentless collecting, her habit of hinting at gifts. In television dramas and films, she is portrayed sometimes as stern matriarch, sometimes as kleptomaniac, always as formidable. But history tends to measure monarchs not by affection, but by endurance. And by that standard, Mary of Teck towers. She steadied her husband, shaped her sons, anchored her granddaughter, and guided her nation through crises that might have shattered the crown. When visitors peer into the exquisite rooms of Queen Mary's dollhouse at Windsor, they see more than craftsmanship. They glimpse an entire philosophy, detail, duty, permanence. That was Mary's gift to the monarchy and her legacy to history. Epilogue. The Iron Thread. History often remembers queens for their glamour or their scandals. Mary of Teck is remembered for something rarer, her endurance. She was not born to rule, not destined for a throne, yet she became the matriarch who steadied Britain's monarchy through its most perilous century. From the sunlit grandeur of the Delhi Durbar to the blacked-out nights of the Blitz, Mary carried the crown with unshakable discipline. She was not always loved, not always understood. Her reserve could feel cold. Her obsession with collecting left her vulnerable to caricature. But when abdication threatened the throne, when bombs rattled Buckingham Palace, when empire gave way to uncertainty, it was Mary's constancy that kept the monarchy from collapsing. Her life stretched from the horse-drawn streets of Victorian London to the dawn of the Jet Age. She buried a husband, 2 sons, and an empire, and yet she lived to see her granddaughter crowned Elizabeth II, ensuring the monarchy's survival into a new age. Mary of Teck was, in the end, the iron thread woven through a fabric constantly at risk of tearing. Neither saint nor thief, she was something more enduring, a guardian. In the quiet strength of her gaze, Britain found the reassurance it needed, and in her legacy, the monarchy found its bridge between past glory and future survival.